I'd now like to introduce Anne Pettifor. Anne is a member of the PEF Council. She's the founder of Prime Economics. She's the co-author of The Green New Deal and books on money and monetary policy. Hello, Anne. I'd like you to give us your first take on the 2020 budget.
Well, I'm really quite excited because what it shows us is that the work that we did at the Progressive Economy Forum, the articles we wrote, the arguments that we made, were being listened to, and they were being listened to at the highest levels. I'm not sure that we've won the argument entirely. I think the government is fairly opportunist, and the Prime Minister is definitely quite opportunist. And I don't imagine for a moment that the Treasury or the OBR are convinced. But we're beginning to see, we opened up this political space, and we are now debating, what the impact of a 3% investment per year, per annum, 3% of GDP investment per annum is going to mean to the economy. And we have a chancellor who thinks that it's going to be good, that it's going to generate income, it's going to create employment, generate income, and tax revenues with which to repay the borrowing. And so for me, that is a vindication of all the hard work that we economists on the Progressive Economy Forum have been doing these last 3 years, really.
So it seems to many of us that the government has performed a massive Uturn.
Yeah.
It says that we can now borrow and spend without limit if we have an emergency, like the coronavirus emergency.
Well, you see, this is politics, and politics is show business, and, one is allowed to change one's tune in show business. And to their credit, they have changed the tune quite radically, and I think in response to public uproar. But unfortunately not enough, really. So there was a lot of very good news in the budget. But as you've already noticed and already commented on, the fact that there's no new money for local authorities and no additional money for local authorities, and there's no money for social care, means investing in the National Health Service at the time of this big coronavirus crisis is pretty pointless, because the NHS's problem is social care, or the lack of social care. And so it's a bit crude of the government to be throwing money at the NHS and ignoring the biggest obstacle the NHS has to freeing up beds and freeing up resources for tackling a crisis such as this one. So it was pretty crude, I have to say. But it was politically smart, and one has to congratulate politicians that are responding to public anger at the fact that the public had to endure 10 years of austerity while, the central bank bailed out the finance sector. The public's mad as hell about that, and it was good to hear politicians responding to that.
But just to pin this down, they could have spent and borrowed in 2010 when we had an emergency following the global financial crisis.
Yeah. And that's because George Osborne was being very political at that point too, and deciding this was a great opportunity to shrink the state, and then used that opportunity. And that was bad politics and bad economics. Unfortunately, the Conservatives never paid the price for that bad politics and that bad economics. And I think that's because there's lots of complicated reasons for that. But I think George Osborne really is responsible for a wasted 10 years, for 10 years of austerity and suffering by the public, and also the degradation of our public's resources. Whether it's public toilets, or whether it's the NHS, or whether it's the quality of care for the elderly or children, he presided over that degradation, and I think about that he should be deeply ashamed. And I have to say that the economists, the mainstream economists, the Treasury and the OBR backed him to the hilt. So if we are going to criticize politicians, we also have to go after the technocrats that backed that austerity.
Government debt has risen during the austerity decade. Does that mean that the austerity years have been completely wasted?
It's an admission that austerity did not work. It didn't do what they said it was going to do. It didn't stimulate recovery. Of course it didn't. The private sector had contracted because it was heavily indebted and because it lacked confidence after a great financial crisis, the biggest financial crisis almost in our history. And the private sector lost its nerve and contracted investment and risk-taking. The banks weren't lending. And in those circumstances, to contract the public sector simultaneously was crazy economics, really. And as I say, this was what the view of both the Treasury and the OBR and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, as well as the right wing of the Tory party.
So The Guardian says today that we are all Keynesians now. What does that mean, and is it true?
No, it's definitely not true, and it causes me great offence, and I know it's causing the great man to turn in his grave. Keynes was deeply uninterested in fiscal policy. He felt that you should never get your economy into such a mess that you had to resort to fiscal policy and to government spending to fix it. And in order for it not to get into that kind of mess, he argued you had to fix the financial system and the monetary system. And that's why his general theory is called the general theory of employment, interest and money. It's not called the general theory of tax and spend, okay? And we still haven't fixed the monetary system. We haven't fixed the financial system. Indeed, the financial system is in much worse state than it was before 2010. We have double the debt we had, global debt that we had in 2010. It's risen to 322% of GDP, and it's something like $257 trillion on a global economy that has income of only about $80 trillion per annum. And that system is out of control. High street banks aren't really responsible anymore for the allocation of finance. That has been done by something called the shadow banking sector. And the shadow banking sector is what it says. It's in the shadows. It's beyond the reach of regulatory democracy. So we don't know what on earth's going on in there. We know that there's a lot that's really dodgy. And this government is not going to do anything about that. It's not going to fix the City of London, and Wall Street is not going to be fixed. And so Keynes would say, sorry, you can't be a Keynesian if you're not addressing the monetary system and if you're not fixing that.
So if the arguments against austerity have been won, what should happen next? Should heads roll?
Definitely. I noticed that Robert Choate is still the head of the OBR. Paul Johnson is still the head of the IFS, and the Treasury, the permanent secretaries and so on at the Treasury have not moved. Really, I'm not in favour of people losing their jobs, but I am in favour of them recognising mistakes and correcting those errors radically, especially when it involves millions of people. These are decisions that are made which affect the lives and the livelihoods, and have affected the lives and livelihoods of millions of innocent people who were not responsible for the crisis in the first place. And I don't think that's happened.
Austerity over the last decade has caused massive problems for poor and vulnerable people. There's been an increase in poverty, a reduction in income, mental health problems, suicides, life expectation has been reduced. Do you think the government should be apologising to those who have suffered as a result of austerity?
Well, it's pretty hard for the government to apologise when the nation has just given them an 80-seat majority. And that is the dilemma we face. And I think the reason is the public have been misled by experts and technocrats, really. There is still a general feeling in the public that governments are like households, and that we have to pay for government spending by, hoarding a bit of some savings here and paying for expenditure that way. And the public doesn't really understand how the finance and monetary system works, and has been deliberately, if you like, misled by economists as well as by technocrats. And so I think there's a great deal of confusion out there. But the fact of the matter is this is a government with a massive mandate, and they won't think that they have to apologise to anyone.
The government appears to be saying that it can end austerity because it now has the fiscal space to do so. Do you think that's right?
There isn't. I mean, there's been the fiscal space all along, and it's been how it's been calculated, and the way in which the OBR calculates the fiscal space and the IFS is to exclude the multiplier. And what thrilled me yesterday was the fact that it seems to me the Chancellor understands the multiplier, which means that if investment is aimed at generating employment, that generates income, which in turn generates tax revenues to help pay for it. And that's the magic of the multiplier. The OBR and the Treasury deny the existence, effectively, of a meaningful multiplier. And that has been a really big problem. The other thing that hasn't been understood is that the debate around Britain's poor productivity is directly linked to a dearth of investment. In terms of the OECD, we have been trailing our OECD partners in the share of our income that has gone into investment. Fortunately, the Chancellor yesterday upped that number, and we're now going to be in line with our OECD partners. But actually, we should be 1 or 2% above to catch up all the lost productivity under austerity, but also because we're facing climate breakdown and the collapse of biodiversity. This is a very terrifying threat. And it did seem to me that the Chancellor was not fully aware of the scale of the threat.
What do you have to say about the content of the budget in relation to the climate change emergency? Have they done enough?
No, they actually put it into reverse. I think he's aiming to spend
a road building scheme.
£27 million on road building, covering the country in tarmac.
So that will make things worse.
Makes things worse. And furthermore, the stimulus provided by the Bank of England, which is aimed at the banks, is going to end up in the mortgage sector. And in other words, it's going to end up in the hands of the government's best friends in the construction sector. And they are going to be doing what they're doing at the moment is, piling concrete on England's green and pleasant land, wherever you look. So they must be thrilled to bits. So both the road lobby and the construction sector, sector is getting easy, cheap money, and we're not at all convinced that that money is going to be transferred to ordinary households. And indeed, they've had a term funding scheme before, and not all of that money has been dispersed. So we know the banks are not making and haven't made the best use of this. And so all of the monetary stimulus is aimed at effectively the construction sector. And yesterday, the Chancellor announced more roads. We just can't afford more roads. We've got to stop driving cars. It's as simple as that. And until the public and the government realizes that, we're not going to be doing anything about the rise in emissions, which is threatening human civilization. And I don't want to sound melodramatic, but it is that grave, actually. And I'm saying that because the scientists are telling us.
So there's a complete failure to actually react to probably the biggest challenge.
The biggest security threat that's faced the British nation in a very, very long time. And they don't understand this as a security threat.
It seems that the influence of the Treasury on the economy is now to be diminished because Downing Street seems to have taken control of the Chancellor. Is that a good thing? Do you think that the Treasury in the past was too cautious and had too much of a cautionary effect on the economy?
Not a moment too soon. I mean, we've had decades. I mean, the Treasury view goes back to the gold standard of the 1920s and 30s and effectively is pretty much the same as it was then. So this is not a moment too soon. But I think simply changing the Chancellor won't necessarily change the Treasury, but it's a very, very big first step.
So a step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about fiscal rules. Yesterday we heard that the current fiscal rules have been abandoned, and we're going to hear in a few months' time what the new ones are going to be. What do you think about fiscal rules? Do we need a fiscal rule? And if so, what do you think it should say?
Well, we don't need fiscal rules, is my answer. And I argued vehemently with the Labour Party leadership over that question and made myself very unpopular. The fact of the matter is that the way to fix the budget is to raise the nation's income. Keynes famously said, you can't balance the budget by cutting the nation's income. And what we've done for the last 10 years is cut the nation's income, both its social income, if you like, but also real income, wages. We've cut those. So naturally, the government, by doing so, is actually, undermining itself, because that cuts tax revenues. We've made jobs very insecure and part-time. That's cut tax revenues for the government. The way to fix and I'm in favour of fixing the public finances. I'm not a deficit financier. I think you can't. Anyway, I think deficit financing is illogical, because the deficit is an outcome of process. It's not a source of financing. And I also don't believe you can finance activity from taxation. Taxes are also an outcome of investment. Governments do what every investor does, what every mortgagee does. It borrows the money, invests, generates the income, tax revenues are generated by that, and it repays the borrowing that way. So for me, to get the public finances back into balance means we've got to get the economy back into balance. We've got to restore prosperity, and then we won't have to think about it. So fiscal rules were invented by monetarists as a way, if you like, of constraining the state. The fact is that we absolutely need the state to intervene when the private sector fails. And the private sector failed catastrophically in 2007-9. And so to withhold the role of the state when the private sector is on its back, so to speak, is a kind of economic suicide, really. So no, I'm against rules. I'm in favour of restoring stability and prosperity to the economy. And I'm also in favour of the economy doing that in a sustainable way within carbon budgets. Because one of the things we now have to become aware of is that we won't just have a government budget to manage. We won't just have the financial budget to manage. We're going to have to think about the carrying capacity of the economy, whether or not how much activity we can afford within the bigger budget, which is the carbon budget. And once we understand we have these three budgets to manage and that they fit inside each other like Russian dolls, with the carbon budget the most important, we're going to have to think very, very differently about spending.
So if you had been Chancellor, I think your budget would have looked rather different to yesterday's budget.
I would have said that we need an economy which will be a steady state economy. We need to focus on human needs and not on human wants and on consumption. Our economy is 2/3 consumption. And I would have said an absolute priority is to make the nation secure against the grave threat of climate breakdown. Flooding, droughts, fires, you name it. We're facing all of that. And it's the responsibility of the state to defend the security of the nation. And I don't think that yesterday's budget did that.
We heard a lot in the budget about spending on physical infrastructure. But what about social infrastructure? Do you think that the government should have been spending money on recruitment of nurses, teachers, doctors, care workers?
Absolutely. So I've been very much part of the Women's Budget Group argument about, it's very, for me, the government's budget is arranged in a way that's quite misogynist. In other words, if you're a construction worker working on HS2, you're going to get public finance invested in the form of capital, but that's going to be part of your job creation and so on.
Do you think that spending on social infrastructure brings the same kind of returns to the economy as spending on physical infrastructure?
Now, the argument is that HS2 is going to generate fees in the future and therefore pay for itself. But equally, if money was invested in a nurse or in nurses or in carers or in teachers, those also operate a multiplier. So a nurse gets paid, pays taxes, and she does that every month and every year, and that in turn those taxes are used to pay for her salary ultimately. So there is a multiplier for the nurse as well as there is for the construction worker. And it's been terribly artificial to separate out those two separate types of work and say this type of work is productive and generates income, but what women do is not. So I've thought it was really I think the budget is really very, very unfair to the vast army of women workers who are maintaining our social capital, if you like.
In summary, it seems as though the arguments against austerity have been won, but I don't think we're seeing the end of austerity. For example, there doesn't seem to be much in the budget to increase spending on local authorities, on schools.
No, and indeed, local authorities are about to take a bigger hit in the next few months. It's all been programmed in, and that hasn't been reversed. Absolutely. So, there is going to be a great deal of benefit from the public investment the Chancellor suggested, proposed yesterday. But there is still the aftermath of the austerity, as you say, which is going to drain the economy and sort of be a countervailing force to the good work that he did yesterday.
So if we can try to tot up some of the costs or avoidable costs of damage to the economy, we've had 10 years of austerity, which may have cost hundreds of billions of lost productivity. That has then led to the Brexit votes, and Mr. Chope yesterday, I think, accepted that we had spent something like 6 billion on the costs of Brexit so far, that the cost to the economy so far was 70 billion. On Brexit due to uncertainty and businesses holding back. And then we will have the Brexit deal itself, which the OBR accepts will damage the economy. That's quite a big lot of money lost, isn't it? Avoidable loss.
Yes, it is. And it isn't just from austerity, in my view. Austerity was a consequence of the breakdown of a globalization project, which was unsustainable. So it was the great financial crisis. And what was striking about the great financial crisis is that monetary authorities across the world united to bail out the private banking system, the 1%. And the rest, not just here, but across the world, incomes were depressed or repressed in the 10 years after the crisis. So austerity is a consequence of that bigger financial crisis, and we are paying the price, the political price for that, in the kind of protectionism that we see in the United States, in India, in the Philippines, in Hungary, in Russia, and in the United States, of course, where putting up walls is the answer to a globalized economy. And here it was taking back control from that globalized economy. So I think the real costs and the real pain that we're suffering is not just from austerity, but is actually from the collapse and the breakdown of globalization. And we see, as we speak here today, coronavirus furthering that breakdown. We are going through a period of deglobalization and greater protectionism, and more walls are going to go up than went up before. So it's a combination of that crisis and then the remedy, so-called, of austerity that has caused us to pay such a very big political and economic price.
What do you think was good about the budget? It's a step in the right direction, that it appears that the arguments against austerity have been won, and we probably will see the end of austerity, but there's much, much more to do.
I think it's a step in the right direction. As far as the climate was concerned, it was a backward step. But the fact of the matter is now there is the acknowledgement that the state has to intervene when the private sector fails.
And that it can borrow and spend. It doesn't have to worry about limits. If there is an emergency, it can borrow.
Right now, there are out there something like, according to the international monitoring body, which monitors the international financial system, there's something like $367 trillion of financial assets. Now, what those financial assets are, we're not quite sure. We know there's loads of money out there. There's loads of savings, and those savings have nowhere to go. At least they feel as if they have nowhere to go. So right now, and that's because they're very fearful, right now, a lot of that money is going into government bonds, because governments and their bonds and their taxpayers, which is the collateral behind the bonds, are the safest place to put money today. And that's why governments are paying negative rates of interest for their bonds. And that is why any government that doesn't use those very low rates of interest over 5, 10, 30 years to borrow to invest is a government that is very, very narrow-minded, has no grasp of economics.
So what do you say to the doom mongers? It seems like people like the IFS are very concerned about where this money is coming from, that this budget doesn't add up and there's trouble ahead.
As the NISR said about the IFS, it has no macroeconomic framework. The IFS is essentially a body of accountants and microeconomists viewing the economy as if they were households, and I really don't think we should take their views seriously.
Thank you very much, Anne Pettifor, for your comments on the topic.